Words without music, the quiet dissociation. You didn't notice. There is a kind of loneliness that doesn't look like loneliness. It doesn't look like crying in the shower. It doesn't look like slammed doors or dramatic exits. It doesn't even look unhappy. It looks responsible. It looks calm. It looks like you. You wake up before the alarm. The house is quiet. For a split second, there's stillness. And then your mind turns on. The checklist starts running. Coffee, emails, kids, meetings, groceries, logistics. You move through your morning like someone who has done this 1,000 times. Because you have. You answer questions, you solve problems, you nod in conversations, you smile when expected, you remember their favorite creamer. You listen to a story you've already heard twice. You ask about their day. And at some point, maybe months ago, maybe years, something subtle shifted. You stopped arriving. You are physically present in your life, but emotionally, you are hovering inches above it. There's a name for this state, but most people never use it. It feels like living underwater. Everything is happening. Sound travels, light moves, people talk. But there's a faint barrier between you and the world. A thin, invisible glass. You're there. But you're not fully there. And here's the shocking part. It didn't happen because you're weak. It happened because you're strong. At first, you tried to fix it. You tried to communicate better. You read articles. You softened your tone. You rehearsed your words in the car before walking inside. You told yourself, if I can just say this the right way, it will land differently. But it didn't. Instead, conversations turned sideways. Your feelings became debates. Your memory became suspect. Your tone became the issue. You started explaining yourself more than expressing yourself, and slowly, not dramatically, your nervous system made a decision. This is too expensive, and so it found a cheaper way to survive. It turned the volume down, not off, just down. You still function. In fact, you function beautifully. If someone looked at your life from the outside, your job, your family, your social media photos, your holiday dinners, they would see stability, reliability, competence. They would not see the quiet dissociation. They would not see the moment you're washing dishes and realize you haven't had a fully authentic conversation in months. And they would not see the way you scan every sentence before you speak it. They would not see how much energy it takes to stay regulated when someone else is unpredictable. They would not see the cost of being the steady one. You became efficient at emotional conservation. You stopped volunteering vulnerable thoughts. You stopped initiating difficult conversations. You stopped sharing parts of yourself that might trigger dismissal or conflict. You became surface level on purpose. And it worked. And the arguments decreased. The tension lowered. The house got quieter. But so did you. There's a phrase that captures this perfectly. Words without music. You still talk. You still show up. You still perform the rituals of connection. But the emotional melody underneath is gone. You're saying the right things without feeling them. It's like being an unpaid emotional assistant in your own relationship. You manage logistics. You smooth tension. You carry invisible weight. But when was the last time someone asked you who you are becoming? When was the last time someone was curious about your interior world? The most dangerous part of this state is how normal it feels. You start calling it maturity. You tell yourself, this is just adulthood. You convince yourself every long-term relationship cools down. But cooling down is not the same as disappearing. And somewhere deep inside, there's a whisper. When did I become a background character in my own life? Yet if this question unsettles you, good, because numbness doesn't ask questions. The fact that something in you is stirring means you are not gone. You adapted. That's what humans do. When honesty led to backlash, you became strategic. When vulnerability led to invalidation, you became contained. When clarity led to chaos, you chose calm. That doesn't make you inauthentic, it makes you intelligent. But intelligence used only for survival slowly turns into self-abandonment. And that's where the real cost begins. Living in mild dissociation is like walking through your life with noise-canceling headphones on. The chaos is muted, but so is the music. The joy is flatter, the laughter is shorter, the spark is dimmer. You don't feel devastated, you feel neutral. And neutrality can be addictive, because neutrality is safer than disappointment. But you were not designed to live in emotional neutral. You were designed to feel connection, friction, intimacy, repair, curiosity. You were designed to be mirrored. Instead, you became measured, careful, controlled. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The longer you live this way, the harder it becomes to remember what fully alive feels like. You may start making small mistakes, forgetting things, losing focus. Not because you're incapable, but because part of your brain is constantly monitoring the emotional climate. It's exhausting to stay half-braced all the time. If any of this resonates, I need you to hear something clearly. You are not broken. You are not dramatic. You are not too sensitive. You adapted to an environment that made authenticity costly. And adaptation is not weakness, but awareness. Awareness is power. If this feels like your life, stay with me, because what you're experiencing has a name, it has a pattern, and more importantly, it has a way out. If this conversation speaks to you, subscribe to this channel. Not because it's trendy, not because it's dramatic, but because clarity changes lives, and I want to keep creating content that helps you see your reality clearly, calmly, and without shame. Your support keeps this work going. Now I want to ask you something simple, but revealing. Which statement feels closer to your current reality? A. I feel like I'm constantly managing the emotional climate around me. B. I feel emotionally disconnected even when everything looks fine on the outside. Comment A or B below, and your answer might tell you more than you think. And in the next part, we're going to talk about the moment you started questioning your own character, and why that moment wasn't weakness, but conditioning. The day you started questioning your own character. There is a moment in narcissistic relationships that rarely gets named, but almost everyone who has lived through one can feel it in their bones. It is not the first argument. It is not the worst fight. And it is not the day you realize something is wrong. It is the day you turn the question inward, the day you stop asking, why are they doing this? And start asking, what is wrong with me? For Sarah in Boston, it happened on an ordinary Tuesday night. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say on her commute home. Nothing dramatic, just a simple observation. She felt dismissed during a conversation the night before. She wasn't accusing. She wasn't attacking. She genuinely wanted clarity, and she waited until after dinner. Calm moment, neutral tone. When you said that last night, it felt like my opinion didn't matter. What she expected was conversation. What she received was correction. That's not what I meant. You're taking it the wrong way. She tried again, softer. I know you might not have meant it that way, but it landed like, you always do this. You twist things. Why are you so sensitive? The shift was subtle but seismic. The focus was no longer on what happened, and the focus was on her sensitivity, her interpretation, her reaction. By the end of the conversation, Sarah wasn't sure what she was defending anymore. She went from explaining how she felt to explaining why she felt. She lay awake that night replaying the exchange. Maybe I did overreact. Maybe my tone was off. Maybe I'm too sensitive. That was the beginning, the day she started auditing her own character. Here's what makes this moment so destabilizing. That you are not someone who avoids accountability. In fact, you pride yourself on reflection. You believe in growth. You are willing to admit mistakes, and that openness becomes the entry point for doubt. When someone consistently reframes your concerns as flaws in you, and you are already wired to self-examine, you don't dismiss it outright. You consider it. You ask yourself if they're right. That's not weakness, that's integrity. But in narcissistic systems, integrity gets turned against you. Mark in Denver experienced it differently. He wasn't expressive by nature. He valued logic, structure, fairness. So when conflicts arose, he approached them like problem-solving exercises. But every attempt at clarity turned into character critique. You're cold. You're controlling. You're impossible to please. He began noticing something strange. No matter the topic, the end result was the same. He was the issue, not the event, not the dynamic. Him. Eventually, he stopped focusing on solutions and started focusing on self-modification. Maybe I need to be more relaxed. Maybe I need to talk less. Maybe I'm too rigid. He didn't see it happening in real time, but the locus of responsibility had quietly shifted. From shared dynamic to personal defect. This is the psychological pivot point in narcissistic relationships. The problem becomes internalized. You move from, this interaction feels unhealthy, to there must be something unhealthy about me. And once that shift happens, everything changes. You begin monitoring yourself more than the relationship. You analyze your tone before speaking. You edit your needs before expressing them. You soften boundaries before setting them. You start preemptively apologizing. I'm probably overthinking this. I might be wrong, but I don't want to make a big deal. These phrases become protective armor, and because you no longer trust that your perception is valid. That is not accidental. When someone consistently positions themselves as rational and you as reactive, they occupy the ground of authority, and you begin negotiating your own reality. Emily in Nashville once described it as standing on unstable flooring. Every time she tried to plant her feet, the surface shifted. Her memories were challenged, her reactions were magnified, her intentions were questioned. Eventually, she stopped asserting confidently. Not because she lacked confidence, because it felt unsafe to stand firmly. This erosion is quiet. It doesn't look like obvious control. It looks like conversation. But conversation where one perspective consistently holds more weight. Over time, you may start collecting evidence against yourself. Times you raised your voice, moments you felt emotional, days you withdrew. You build a mental case file. Maybe I am difficult. Maybe I am too much. And maybe I expect too much. And here's the tragedy. The very qualities that made you a good partner, empathy, reflection, accountability, are now being used as proof of your instability. Because you're the only one questioning yourself. The narcissistic partner rarely does. This creates moral injury, not just hurt. Injury to your sense of being a good person. You don't just feel misunderstood, you feel flawed. And flawed feels fixable, so you try harder. You become more patient, more measured, more accommodating. You assume if you improve yourself enough, harmony will return. But the improvement never satisfies the system, because the system depends on imbalance. And the more you self-adjust without reciprocal accountability, the more distorted the power dynamic becomes. There's also something deeply isolating about this stage. From the outside, everything looks fine. You still function. You still show up. You still attend events and smile. So when you internally question yourself, there's little external validation. You may even hear praise about your partner's confidence or success, which deepens your confusion. If everyone else sees them as stable, maybe I really am the unstable one. That thought can anchor itself in your identity. But here's what needs to be said clearly. The fact that you questioned yourself does not mean you were wrong. It means you were trying to make sense of something destabilizing. Healthy relationships allow space for two truths, while narcissistic systems collapse space into one. And when only one narrative survives consistently, the other person starts dissolving into self-doubt. If you are someone who has asked, "Am I the narcissist?" simply because you noticed yourself adapting, that question alone is evidence of conscience. Narcissistic personalities rarely sit in deep self-examination unless it serves image repair. You, on the other hand, lay awake analyzing your tone. That is not narcissism, and that is responsibility under pressure. The day you started questioning your character was not the day you became flawed. It was the day the distortion turned inward. But distortion does not equal truth, and the fact that you are now aware of that shift is not a sign of collapse. It is the first step toward reclaiming your internal authority. You were never the villain for caring enough to self-reflect. You were simply navigating a system that rewarded your doubt and penalized your clarity. And now that you can see that, something important becomes possible. You can question the narrative, not yourself. The architecture of a narcissistic system built on distortion. There is a reason you could not fix it, not with better communication, not with more patience, not with softer tone or stronger boundaries. Because what you were living inside was not simply a difficult relationship. It was a structure, and structures are not repaired by effort alone. They are sustained by design. A narcissistic system is not chaos. It is not random volatility. It is organized around one central priority, the preservation of a fragile identity that must never be exposed as flawed. Everything else rearranges itself around that priority. To understand why you adapted the way you did, you have to understand the architecture. Let's go back to Sarah in Boston. From the outside, her life appeared stable. Her husband was articulate, socially skilled, admired in professional circles, and they hosted gatherings, they traveled, they maintained appearances with impressive consistency. Inside the relationship, though, there was an invisible hierarchy. If something went wrong, there was already an answer waiting. If a disagreement arose, there was already a conclusion formed. If Sarah felt hurt, the response was rarely curiosity. It was clarification, correction, containment. Not loud, not violent, just definitive. Over time, she began noticing something subtle, and conversations had gravity. They bent toward one center. No matter where they began, they ended with her reassessing herself. That's the foundation of a narcissistic system. Reality is not shared. It is curated. Curated reality means events are filtered through a single lens. The lens that protects the narcissistic individual's self-concept. If an event threatens that self-concept, it cannot remain intact. It must be reframed, minimized, redirected, or denied. So Mark in Denver experienced this as well, but in a different form. When he tried to discuss practical concerns, finances, scheduling, long-term planning, the conversation would shift from content to character. You're controlling. You always think you're right. The issue dissolved. The focus moved to him. This is structural. Because in a narcissistic system, accountability feels like annihilation. To admit fault would mean confronting a fragile core that cannot tolerate shame. So the system reorganizes to avoid that exposure. And here's where it becomes complex. Not every distortion is an obvious lie. Sometimes it's emphasis. Your missteps are magnified. Their missteps are contextualized. Your tone is dissected. Their tone is justified. Proportion becomes skewed. Emily in Nashville described it as living in a house where mirrors were subtly warped. She didn't see a grotesque reflection. She saw something almost accurate, but slightly stretched in certain places. Yet her emotions looked bigger. Her requests looked heavier. Her needs looked unreasonable. She didn't realize the distortion at first, because distortion is gradual. You don't wake up one morning in a narcissistic system and think, this is completely detached from reality. Instead, you adjust to small inconsistencies. You let a comment slide. You dismiss a contradiction. You rationalize a defensive response. Over time, those adjustments accumulate, and the structure stabilizes around imbalance. Another pillar of this architecture is image. Image is not vanity here. It is defense. Public perception reinforces internal superiority. If the outside world affirms the narcissistic individual as competent, charming, accomplished, then internal conflicts can be reframed as anomalies or your fault. This is why narcissistic systems often look polished from a distance. Vacations appear joyful, careers appear successful, social gatherings appear harmonious, in that external validation strengthens the internal distortion. Because if everyone else sees them as admirable, then your discomfort must be exaggeration. That's how doubt deepens. In healthy systems, conflict expands understanding. In narcissistic systems, conflict threatens identity. And when identity is threatened, the structure tightens. Gaslighting is not always dramatic denial. Sometimes it's subtle revision. That's not how it happened. You're remembering it wrong. You're projecting. These statements don't scream. They erode, and erosion changes landscapes. Over time, you begin preemptively editing your perception. You replay conversations before bringing them up. You question your interpretation. You second-guess your instincts. The architecture doesn't need to cage you. It simply needs to make you doubt yourself enough to stop pushing against it. There is also something deeply destabilizing about certainty. Narcissistic personalities often deliver distortion with conviction. Confidence is persuasive. When someone speaks with unwavering assurance, the human brain naturally pauses. Maybe they're right. And because you are capable of self-reflection, you consider that possibility. That openness becomes a vulnerability. In systems built on distortion, the most reflective person carries the most doubt, and because the other person rarely engages in reciprocal examination. This creates asymmetry. One person questions, the other asserts. One person adjusts, the other solidifies. And the longer this dynamic persists, the more natural it feels. You stop noticing the tilt. You adapt your steps to the uneven floor. You become skilled at predicting reactions. You become skilled at minimizing impact. You become skilled at emotional containment. The architecture holds firm because it no longer needs force, and it has your compliance. But here's something crucial. Compliance in this context is not agreement, it is exhaustion. You didn't stop challenging distortion because you believed it. You stopped because pushing against it cost too much energy. That distinction matters, because once you see the structure, you stop personalizing every fracture. You stop believing that better phrasing will fix foundational imbalance. And you recognize that you were living inside a system designed to protect ego over truth. And seeing that does not require you to explode the system, it simply changes how you move within it. Clarity does not destroy the architecture overnight, but it cracks the illusion that you were the unstable beam. You were not unstable. You were standing inside a structure that required distortion to remain intact. And once you understand that, you stop trying to straighten yourself to fit crooked walls. You begin asking whether the walls were ever straight to begin with. That question is quiet, but it is powerful. Because awareness is the first structural shift that does not depend on their participation. It belongs entirely to you. The survival lie. When honesty becomes dangerous. There is a moment when honesty stops feeling noble. It stops feeling brave. It stops feeling virtuous. It starts feeling dangerous, not physically dangerous, perhaps. Not in the obvious way people imagine when they hear the word danger. But emotionally dangerous, psychologically destabilizing, exhausting in a way that makes your chest tighten before you even open your mouth. That is the moment the survival lie is born. Mark in Denver didn't wake up one morning and decide to become dishonest. He prided himself on being straightforward. He believed in transparency. If something bothered him, he addressed it. If he needed time alone, he said so. And in the early days of his marriage, he would say, "I'm going to the gym after work." Simple, clear. The response wasn't explosive at first. It was layered. "So I guess I'll just handle everything myself. Must be nice to have so much free time. You really don't prioritize this family." The statement was neutral. The reaction was moral. Going to the gym became selfishness. Needing space became neglect. Honesty became indictment. Over time, and the emotional cost of truth began to outweigh its moral purity. He noticed something subtle. If he said, "I have to stay late at work," the evening was calmer. Fewer accusations, less tension. The air in the house felt lighter. The first time he said it, his stomach dropped. He hated how it felt. The 5th time, it felt strategic. The 10th time, it felt necessary. This is how survival lies form, not from malice, from pattern recognition. When your nervous system repeatedly associates honesty with conflict, it begins to reroute. Humans are wired to minimize threat. If direct truth consistently produces escalation, the body searches for alternatives. You don't wake up thinking, "I want to deceive." You wake up thinking, "I want peace." And if peace requires editing the truth, the edit begins to feel justified. Sarah in Boston experienced it differently. She stopped telling the full story of her day, and not because she was hiding something dramatic, but because details invited interrogation. If she mentioned having coffee with a colleague, the follow-up questions felt less like curiosity and more like suspicion. If she shared excitement about a new opportunity, it was met with subtle undermining. Eventually, she learned to shrink her disclosures. Work was fine. The meeting was good. Nothing special happened. It was easier to offer neutral summaries than risk emotional turbulence. The lie wasn't in fabrication. It was in omission. And omission can feel just as heavy. Emily in Nashville faced a more tangible version. When she suggested helping her brother financially, the refusal wasn't just firm. It was absolute. The conversation ended in dismissal, but her sense of responsibility didn't disappear. So she adjusted. She clipped coupons. She shaved dollars off grocery bills. She tucked small amounts away quietly. Was she lying? Technically, yes. But what she was really doing was redistributing power. When direct negotiation fails repeatedly, secrecy becomes a form of autonomy. The survival lie is rarely about grand betrayal. It's about micro-adjustments that reduce exposure. You tell them you're running errands when you're sitting in your car for 10 extra minutes to breathe. You say traffic was heavier than usual when you deliberately took the long route home to clear your head. And you claim exhaustion to avoid a social event where you'll have to manage appearances. Each lie is small. Each lie feels rational. Each lie preserves a fragment of stability. But here is where the internal fracture forms. You value honesty. You have always valued honesty. So every strategic edit creates dissonance. You start wondering what this makes you. Am I manipulative? Am I becoming like them? The comparison is painful because you know narcissistic individuals lie to protect image, gain control, or avoid accountability. Your lies feel different. They are not about dominance. They are about survival. That distinction is not self-justification, it is psychological reality. When honesty becomes dangerous, lying becomes adaptive. There is a deeper layer here that few people articulate. Honesty requires safety. It requires a nervous system that believes expression will not result in punishment, ridicule, or escalation. If safety is absent, honesty feels like stepping into traffic. Your body tightens, your breath shortens, you anticipate impact. so you cross the street somewhere else. The tragedy is not that you lied. The tragedy is that the environment made truth costly. Over time, the survival lie becomes normalized. Arguments decrease. The house feels calmer. From the outside, things may even look improved. But inside, something begins to erode. You start feeling inauthentic. You feel split. There is the version of you that exists publicly within the relationship, and the version of you that exists privately in your thoughts. That split is heavy. You may even find yourself lying reflexively in places where it's no longer necessary. In conversations with friends, in professional settings. Your nervous system learned that directness carries risk and it doesn't always recalibrate quickly. That realization can be terrifying, because integrity matters to you, and here is the crucial truth. The fact that you feel unsettled by your own survival behavior is evidence of your integrity, not its absence. Narcissistic deception expands ego. Survival deception reduces threat. One inflates self-image, the other protects emotional stability. But the nervous system does not categorize morality. It categorizes safety, and safety often wins. You are not choosing deceit over virtue. You are choosing predictability over chaos. And the survival lie also carries an ironic consequence. By reducing conflict, it can prolong the relationship. Calm replaces confrontation. Superficial harmony replaces authenticity, and because the storms are less frequent, the deeper structural issue remains unchallenged. You may even begin blaming yourself more. If I were honest, maybe this would implode. Maybe I'm the reason this is dysfunctional. But look closer. You didn't create the conditions that made honesty unsafe. You responded to them. And response is not the same as cause. The survival lie is not your identity. It is a tactic born from imbalance. The key is awareness, not condemnation. When you see it clearly, you can begin asking different questions. Where is honesty safe in my life? Where can I practice directness without fear? How can I rebuild the muscle of truth in spaces that honor it? You do not need to shame yourself for surviving. You need to understand what you were surviving inside. And because once honesty is no longer dangerous, it does not feel like sacrifice. It feels like relief. And the fact that you long for that relief means your integrity was never lost. It was waiting for safety. The coffee can effect. Tiny acts of hidden autonomy. There is a particular kind of rebellion that makes no noise. It doesn't slam doors. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It hides in grocery receipts, in 10 extra minutes in a parking lot. It's in $20 folded into the back of a drawer. It is small, almost invisible. But for the person living inside a narcissistic system, it can feel enormous. Emily in Nashville once told herself she was being ridiculous. All she had done was shave $20 off the weekly grocery bill. She clipped coupons, compared prices, switched brands, walked an extra aisle. At checkout, she felt that familiar tightening in her chest. Not because she had done something wrong, but because she knew what she was about to do next. She would quietly keep the difference, not to splurge, not to deceive in any grand way, but to build a tiny cushion, a coffee can hidden behind winter scarves in the back of the closet. The first time she slid the folded bill inside, her hands trembled. It wasn't about the money. It was about what the money represented. Choice. In a system where financial decisions were tightly controlled, debated, or dismissed, and that $20 wasn't currency, it was oxygen. That's the coffee can effect. Tiny acts of hidden autonomy that restore a fragment of self-governance. From the outside, these actions look insignificant. From the inside, they can feel like reclaiming a pulse. Mark in Denver experienced his version differently. He didn't hide cash. He hid time. He would volunteer to pick up dry cleaning across town instead of the closer location. And the longer drive gave him 15 uninterrupted minutes in his car. No monitoring, no commentary, no emotional calibration required. He would sit in silence at red lights, feeling his shoulders drop. He didn't tell anyone he was stretching the errand. It wasn't about deception. It was about breathing. Sarah in Boston began doing something even quieter. She started journaling in a notebook she kept at the bottom of her work bag. Not on her phone, not in a shared digital space, a physical notebook that existed only for her. In it, she wrote the unfiltered version of events, not the softened version she shared at home, not the careful summary she gave friends, the raw truth. She wasn't planning to confront anyone with it. She wasn't collecting evidence. She was anchoring herself. When you live inside distortion long enough, private documentation becomes a form of self-rescue. The coffee can effect isn't always about money. It's about restoring authorship. In narcissistic systems often shrink personal agency gradually. Decisions become centralized, preferences become negotiable, needs become optional. So autonomy goes underground. It finds creative roots. It becomes strategic. You might tell your partner you're going to one store when you quietly choose another, just to feel the sensation of independent choice. You might take a different walking route home simply because it belongs to you, and you might sign up for a class and mention it casually after the fact, instead of requesting permission beforehand. Each act is small, but psychologically each act says something powerful. I still exist. There's a paradox here. These hidden acts can bring relief, but they can also bring shame. You may find yourself asking, why can't I just be direct? Why am I sneaking around my own life? And that question can sting, because you never imagined becoming someone who operates in secrecy. But secrecy in this context is not about betrayal. It is about survival within constraint. When open negotiation repeatedly fails, autonomy adapts. It goes quiet. It becomes discreet. It hides in coffee cans. There's also something deeply symbolic about these gestures. They are proof that your spirit hasn't collapsed. Even when you phone it in, even when you edit the truth, even when you minimize your voice, a part of you is still reaching for sovereignty. That reaching matters, because it means you haven't surrendered internally. Emily didn't just save money, she was preparing options. Mark didn't just extend errands, he was preserving sanity. Sarah didn't just journal, she was protecting memory. The coffee can effect often appears when direct empowerment feels unreachable. And here's the nuance. It can be both adaptive and limiting. Adaptive because it gives you micro-control. Limiting because it keeps autonomy small. $20 at a time, to 15 minutes at a time, one hidden notebook at a time. If these acts are all you have, they can become lifelines. But they can also become cages if they never expand. The key is awareness. Ask yourself, are these hidden acts stabilizing me temporarily? Or are they the only form of self I allow myself to have? There is dignity in survival strategy, but there is also potential for growth beyond it. The coffee can effect reveals something profound about human resilience. When overt power is restricted, covert power develops. When voice is minimized, creativity emerges. When control is centralized, autonomy decentralizes itself in subtle ways. This is not manipulation, it is adaptation under pressure. And adaptation does not mean you are small. It means you are resourceful, but here is the deeper invitation. What if these tiny acts are not the end goal? What if they are rehearsal? What if the $20 is not just savings, but a reminder that financial agency is possible? What if the extended drive is not just escape, but proof that solitude is restorative? What if the private journal is not just containment, but preparation for eventual clarity? Small autonomy builds internal muscle, and muscles grow when used. You do not need to shame yourself for surviving quietly. You do not need to diminish the significance of small rebellions. They kept you intact. They reminded you that beneath compliance, and there was still choice. The coffee can may be hidden, but what it represents is not. It represents the part of you that refused to disappear. And that part, no matter how quietly it moves, is the foundation of everything that comes next. Desperation. Triangulation. When you need a messenger, there is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from not being heard, not disagreed with, not debated, not even rejected outright, just dismissed. You open your mouth, and before your sentence fully forms, you can already feel it evaporating in the air. In healthy systems, communication flows in two directions. Ideas move back and forth. Influence is shared. Even disagreement carries mutual recognition. But in narcissistic systems, influence often travels one way. And when you realize that direct communication no longer works, something inside you begins looking for another route. That's where desperation triangulation begins. Not from manipulation, from necessity. Laura in San Diego didn't think of herself as someone who played games. She valued honesty. She preferred straightforwardness. But after years of watching her suggestions dismissed almost automatically, she noticed a pattern. When she proposed repainting the dining room, the idea was impractical. When she suggested replacing an aging appliance, it was overreacting. When she asked directly for something to change, the answer was reflexively no. Not always loudly, but predictably. Then something unexpected happened. At a neighborhood barbecue, their neighbor, a contractor her husband respected, casually mentioned that repainting the dining room in a lighter color would increase resale value. Suddenly, the idea was interesting, worth considering. Laura felt a strange mix of relief and humiliation. Relief that the change might happen, humiliation that it required someone else's mouth to carry her thought. And that moment is the emotional core of desperation triangulation. It is the realization that your voice does not hold weight in the system, but someone else's might. Mark in Denver encountered this in a professional context. At home, financial discussions went nowhere when he initiated them. But if a trusted friend, someone admired for business acumen, raised the same topic during dinner, the tone shifted. The idea received consideration. Mark began wondering if he should seed conversations indirectly. Suggest an idea to the friend first. Let the friend introduce it later. He hated the strategy, but he also wanted stability. That internal conflict is real. Triangulation in its unhealthy form is a common narcissistic tactic. Pitting people against each other, controlling narratives, manipulating alliances. But desperation triangulation is different. It is not about gaining power. It is about gaining traction, and it is what happens when direct access to influence is blocked. Emily in Nashville experienced it when she needed support for something related to her family. Every direct request was framed as unreasonable. So she confided in a relative her husband admired, hoping that relative might casually advocate on her behalf. It worked, and it felt awful. Because even though the outcome aligned with her needs, the path to get there required maneuvering. You may have found yourself doing similar things, asking a mother-in-law to mention something you know your partner would ignore coming from you. Encouraging a respected colleague to suggest an idea at work because your contributions are routinely dismissed. Framing your desires indirectly so they sound like someone else's initiative. Each time you may have asked yourself, am I becoming manipulative? That question is heavy, but pause. In systems where your voice is chronically devalued, seeking alternative routes is not evidence of narcissism. It is evidence of desperation. The deeper psychological toll of desperation triangulation isn't just the strategy itself, it's the message underneath it. My words alone are not enough. That belief chips away at dignity. Healthy relationships do not require spokespersons. They do not require middlemen. They do not require social leverage to validate personal needs. When triangulation becomes necessary for basic progress, the system is already unbalanced. There is also risk involved, and if the narcissistic individual senses that you are influencing indirectly, the backlash can be severe. Because narcissistic systems are acutely sensitive to perceived loss of control. Why didn't you just tell me? Are you trying to turn people against me? The accusation reframes your survival tactic as betrayal. And again, you are placed on the defensive. This is why desperation triangulation often remains limited to high-stakes issues. Safety concerns, financial necessities, and opportunities that cannot be ignored. It is rarely used casually. It is used when direct routes are consistently blocked. The emotional cost, however, accumulates. You begin feeling like a political strategist inside your own home. You analyze alliances, you calculate timing, you test receptivity. That level of vigilance is exhausting. It shifts you from partner to tactician, from equal to operator, and even when it works, the victory feels hollow. Because deep down, what you want is not leverage. You want mutual respect. There is another subtle danger. When you triangulate repeatedly, even for survival, you risk normalizing indirect communication patterns. You may begin carrying that habit into healthier spaces. Suggesting instead of stating, hinting instead of asking, positioning instead of expressing. That's why awareness matters. Desperation triangulation is a strategy, not an identity. It is something you learned in response to imbalance, but it is not who you are. Laura eventually realized something important. Every time she routed her voice through someone else, she reinforced the belief that her voice alone wasn't sufficient. So she began experimenting in safer environments. With friends who listened, with a therapist who validated, she practiced directness where it could be received. Because the goal is not to perfect triangulation. The goal is to restore confidence in your own voice. And if you have used desperation triangulation, do not rush to shame. Ask instead, what conditions made this necessary? That question reveals structure. And when you understand the structure, you can begin rebuilding communication muscles elsewhere. You were never scheming for dominance. You were searching for influence in a system that denied it. There is a difference. And recognizing that difference protects your integrity. Desperation triangulation is not a sign that you are manipulative, and it is a sign that you are navigating blocked doors. The next step is not to condemn yourself for finding alternate routes. It is to remember that in healthy spaces, doors open without intermediaries. And your voice stands on its own. When lying stops feeling wrong, and that scares you, there is a moment that unsettles you more than the first lie ever did. It's not the first time you edited the truth. It's not the first time you omitted a detail. And it's not even the first time you deliberately said something untrue to avoid fallout. It's the moment when you realize it no longer feels wrong. That is the moment that scares you. Because you have always believed you were an honest person. Integrity mattered to you. You were the one who valued transparency, the one who disliked manipulation, the one who believed that truth, even when uncomfortable, was better than performance. So when lying becomes easier, smoother, almost automatic, it shakes something deeper than guilt. It shakes identity. Sarah in Boston noticed it one afternoon at work. A colleague casually asked how things were at home. Without thinking, she smiled and said, "Good, busy, but good." It wasn't a dramatic lie. It was socially acceptable, polished, expected. But later, sitting in her car, she realized she didn't even feel the internal flinch anymore. There was no pang, no internal correction, just fluid performance. Even that realization unsettled her more than any argument had. Because the survival lies had crossed a threshold. They weren't just strategic anymore. They were reflexive. Mark in Denver experienced something similar in a different setting. He found himself preemptively shaping stories before speaking. Not just with his partner, but with friends. He would downplay frustration, avoid nuance, edit details instinctively. He caught himself mid-sentence one evening, realizing he had distorted a harmless detail for no reason at all. Nothing would have happened if he'd told the truth, no conflict, no backlash. Yet his nervous system had already chosen concealment. That's when the fear crept in. What if this is who I am now? That question cuts deep, because when lying stops feeling wrong, it no longer feels like something you're doing. It feels like something you've become. Here's what is happening psychologically. And when you repeatedly use deception to reduce emotional threat, your nervous system begins categorizing it as protective behavior. At first, the body reacts. Tight stomach, racing thoughts, guilt. Over time, repetition rewires the response. The lie becomes efficient. Low risk, predictable, and your internal alarm softens. This is not moral decay, it is conditioning. The same way someone who lives near train tracks eventually stops hearing the trains, you stop feeling the jolt of dishonesty, and the behavior normalized because the environment demanded it. Emily in Nashville once described it as sliding down a gentle slope. She didn't leap into deception, she slid. First, small omissions, then carefully worded half-truths, then fully fabricated explanations when necessary. And each time, the conflict that would have followed honesty was avoided. The relief reinforced the behavior. Relief is powerful. Relief tells the brain, do that again. Eventually, the internal narrative shifts. Instead of asking, is this wrong? You begin asking, is this necessary? And necessity overrides morality when survival is at stake. But the deeper fear isn't about morality, it's about identity drift. You begin worrying that you are becoming manipulative, that you are mirroring the very behavior that hurt you. And that fear is painful because you do not want to resemble the source of your confusion. Here is the distinction that matters. Narcissistic deception is rooted in entitlement and control. And survival deception is rooted in self-protection and harm reduction. One seeks power, the other seeks stability. But when you live in distortion long enough, the lines can blur internally. Because behaviorally, a lie is still a lie. And if you value integrity, that creates tension. You may notice something else too. When lying becomes easier in the narcissistic relationship, it can begin spilling into other areas. You avoid difficult truths in friendships. You sidestep vulnerability at work. You downplay your needs in healthier spaces. Not because you want to deceive, but because concealment has become your default safety mechanism. That's the real danger, not the lies themselves, but the erosion of your comfort with directness. The moment lying stops feeling wrong is not proof that you are corrupted. It is proof that you adapted thoroughly, and adaptation can overshoot its target. The skill that once protected you can begin operating automatically, which is why awareness becomes critical. The fear you feel, the one that whispers, "I don't want to become this," is actually a good sign. It means your conscience is intact. If you were truly indifferent to dishonesty, you wouldn't be disturbed by it. The discomfort is evidence of alignment trying to return. Mark once asked himself a simple question that shifted something inside him. Where do I feel safe telling the full truth? The answer wasn't nowhere. It was selective. With one close friend, you in therapy, in quiet journal entries. The truth still existed in his life. It just wasn't safe everywhere. That realization reframed everything. He hadn't lost his integrity, he had compartmentalized it. Sarah began experimenting with micro-honesty in low-risk spaces. Small corrections, clearer statements. Not dramatic confessions, just subtle recalibration. Emily started noticing when she was about to lie automatically and paused. Not to shame herself, just to observe. That pause matters, and because reflex becomes choice the moment you become aware of it. The goal is not to beat yourself up for surviving. The goal is to slowly rebuild environments where honesty does not require armor. Lying stopped feeling wrong because it stopped feeling dangerous to your identity and started feeling necessary for your stability. That shift protected you once, but you are allowed to outgrow survival tactics. You are allowed to reclaim directness, and the fear that you are becoming just as bad is understandable. But it is also distorted. You did not lie to dominate. You lied to breathe. There is a difference. And the fact that you still care about that difference means your core self is not gone. It is waiting for safer ground. When honesty is no longer punished, it stops feeling like risk. It starts feeling like relief. And relief, not fear, is what integrity actually feels like. Communication doesn't work here, and that's not your fault. There is a specific kind of shame that grows when you believe communication is the cure. And it keeps failing anyway. You read the books, you watch the videos, you practiced "I feel" statements, you softened your tone, you chose your timing carefully, you told yourself, if I can just communicate better, this will improve. And when it didn't, the conclusion felt obvious. It must be me. Because everywhere you look, healthy relationships are described the same way. Open dialogue, active listening, mutual vulnerability, repair after conflict, clear expression of needs. Communication is framed as the master key. So when the door won't open, you assume your technique is wrong. But here is the truth that rarely gets said clearly enough. Communication only works when two people are committed to reality. It requires mutual curiosity, emotional regulation, a willingness to be wrong, and a capacity to tolerate discomfort without turning it into attack. Without those elements, communication is not a bridge, it's a spotlight. And in narcissistic systems, spotlights feel threatening. Sarah in Boston tried everything. She scheduled conversations thoughtfully. She chose calm moments. She avoided accusatory language. She even practiced in front of a mirror to make sure her delivery was measured. Still, discussions bent sideways. If she brought up feeling unheard, and the focus moved to her tone. If she clarified a boundary, the conversation shifted to her timing. If she asked for accountability, she was accused of creating conflict. Eventually, she started wondering if she was fundamentally incapable of healthy communication. But the problem was never her clarity. It was the system's intolerance for shared reality. Communication assumes two people are working toward understanding. In narcissistic dynamics, understanding is secondary to control. Mark in Denver discovered something similar. He approached conflict logically, hoping structure would help. He laid out points clearly. He invited feedback. He even asked what he could do differently. But the pattern repeated. His words were dissected for flaws rather than received for meaning. His intention was questioned rather than explored. He realized something painful. No matter how precise his phrasing, the outcome was predetermined. And if the conversation threatened the narcissistic partner's self-image, it would be deflected. Not because he failed, but because the system could not tolerate exposure. This is where communication advice becomes harmful. When outsiders say, "Have you tried communicating better?" They assume neutrality in the system. They assume both parties are equally invested in mutual growth. But when one person views accountability as attack, Communication becomes ammunition. Every word can be twisted. Every emotion can be reframed as instability. Every boundary can be labeled selfishness. Over time, you learn something your body understands before your mind does. Direct communication here is dangerous, not physically but relationally. It escalates tension. It triggers defensiveness. It invites retaliation or withdrawal. So you adapt. You speak less. You share selectively. You gray rock. You offer logistics instead of emotion. You stop expecting repair. And then another layer of shame appears. Why can't I just speak up? Why am I so afraid of conflict? The answer is not cowardice, it is conditioning. When repeated attempts at authentic communication lead to dismissal or distortion, your nervous system encodes the pattern. Expression equals turbulence. Silence equals stability. That encoding is not weakness, it is learning. Emily in Nashville once described it as forgetting how to ride a bike. Before the relationship, she was expressive, engaged, direct. She valued depth. Years into the dynamic, she found herself hesitating even with friends. Words felt clumsy. Vulnerability felt risky. She would start a sentence and then trail off. It wasn't that she had lost her voice. It was that she had practiced silence for too long. Communication is a muscle. And in narcissistic systems, that muscle atrophies because it is rarely rewarded. There is also something else that happens. You begin obsessing over wording. You overanalyze emails, and you rehearse conversations repeatedly. You replay past discussions searching for the exact phrase that caused the conflict. This hypervigilance creates the illusion that if you find the perfect combination of words, everything will click. But perfection does not solve structural imbalance. In fact, the more you polish your communication, the more you reinforce the idea that the failure rests on your delivery. The truth is harder. Communication cannot thrive where curiosity is absent, and it cannot build intimacy where empathy is missing. It cannot create safety where vulnerability is weaponized. That realization can feel devastating, because it means effort alone cannot fix it. But it is also liberating, because it removes misplaced responsibility. Sarah did not fail because she lacked emotional intelligence. Mark did not fail because he lacked clarity. Emily did not fail because she was too sensitive. The environment was incompatible with mutual exchange, and recognizing incompatibility is not defeat, it is discernment. This does not mean you stop communicating altogether. It means you recalibrate expectations. You use communication strategically for logistics. You reserve vulnerability for safer spaces. You practice directness where it can be received. You stop trying to extract intimacy from someone unwilling to meet you there. That shift reduces self-blame. It allows you to separate your communication skill from the system's capacity. You can be an excellent communicator and still be unheard in a distorted environment. Both can be true. The mistake many survivors make is assuming that because communication failed there, they are broken everywhere. But take a moment and look outside the relationship. Do friends understand you? Do colleagues respond positively? Do other people receive your thoughts without defensiveness? If the answer is yes, the problem was never your voice. It was the context. Communication is powerful, but it is not magic. It cannot override ego defenses. It cannot force empathy. It cannot create mutuality unilaterally. And accepting that does not mean you give up on connection. It means you stop misdirecting your effort. You stop trying to plant seeds in soil that rejects them. You begin planting elsewhere. Communication doesn't work here, and that is not your fault. It is a structural truth. And once you stop personalizing structural limits, you reclaim something critical. It's your confidence in your own voice. Why you stay, the practical anchors no one talks about. There is a question people ask too quickly. If it's that bad, why don't you just leave? It sounds logical, clean, empowered. But real life is rarely clean. And the people who ask that question usually aren't calculating custody schedules at 2 a.m. They aren't reviewing health insurance coverage tied to a spouse's employer. They aren't looking at housing prices in Boston, Denver, or Nashville and realizing that one income doesn't stretch far enough. They aren't factoring in immigration paperwork, aging parents, shared businesses, or children who adore both parents. The truth is, staying is often less about confusion and more about gravity. There are anchors no one talks about. Sarah in Boston did not stay because she didn't understand the dynamic. By the time she reached clarity, she could name the distortion without hesitation. She could see the patterns. She could predict the reactions. But she also had 2 children who split their time between piano lessons, school projects, and bedtime rituals that relied on stability. Leaving didn't just mean freedom, it meant custody schedules. It meant holidays divided. It meant long-term legal entanglement with the same person, just in a different form. And she asked herself a question few people admit out loud. Would leaving reduce the chaos or redistribute it? That question has weight. Mark in Denver faced a different anchor. Financial interdependence, shared investments, a mortgage, retirement accounts, years of intertwined logistics. He wasn't naive about the relationship anymore. He had stopped idealizing it, but disentangling would require lawyers, mediation, asset division, possible relocation. And beyond money, there was something subtler: identity. They had built a life that looked successful from the outside. Leaving would mean publicly dismantling that image, explaining to family, to colleagues, to friends. Not because he feared judgment, but because he knew the narrative would not be simple. The world prefers clear villains and victims. Real life is layered. Emily in Nashville carried yet another anchor. Loyalty. Not blind loyalty, but the kind shaped by years of shared history. Inside every narcissistic dynamic there are good moments, shared memories, private jokes, early love that once felt real. Leaving doesn't erase those memories, and sometimes what keeps someone in place is not delusion. It is grief. Grief over what once existed. Grief over what could have been. Grief over the family unit that would fracture. These anchors are rarely dramatic. They are practical. Children's school districts, health insurance coverage, cultural expectations, religious values, visa status, community ties, shared social circles. The longer the relationship, the heavier the web. There is also something rarely acknowledged. Sometimes you stay because leaving does not guarantee peace. If the narcissistic dynamic includes high conflict, leaving can intensify that conflict, at least temporarily. Legal battles, reputation management, custody disputes. For some, staying feels like containment, not happiness, containment, and containment can feel safer than open warfare. This does not mean staying is always the right choice. It means the choice is rarely simple. There is another quiet anchor that deserves honesty. A fear of starting over, not fear of being alone. Fear of exhaustion. Rebuilding a life in your 30s, 40s, or 50s is not romantic. It is paperwork, budgeting, logistics, emotional recalibration. It requires energy. And when you have been living in survival mode for years, energy is already depleted. Sometimes people stay not because they believe things will change, but because they are too tired to detonate their entire structure at once. That is not weakness, and that is resource management. The mistake society makes is assuming clarity automatically leads to exit, but clarity sometimes leads to strategic staying. You might think, I will stay until the youngest graduates. I will stay until I secure financial independence. I will stay while I build a parallel support system. That is not denial. That is planning. There is also the quiet, painful reality that some narcissistic relationships are not fully escapable. Co-parenting ties, family systems, your shared workplaces. You may not be able to remove the person entirely from your life. So the question becomes less about leaving and more about restructuring engagement. Staying does not always mean surrender. It can mean calculated exposure, reduced vulnerability, clear internal boundaries. You stop trying to extract intimacy. You stop expecting repair. You begin seeing the relationship for what it is and adjusting accordingly. That shift changes the experience of staying. It becomes less about hope and more about strategy. But let's address something deeper. Many survivors feel ashamed for staying. They believe it invalidates their pain. They assume strength equals immediate departure. But strength can also look like measured timing. It can look like protecting children from escalation. It can look like building a financial runway quietly. It can look like gathering information before making irreversible moves. Sarah did not stay because she was confused. Mark did not stay because he was unaware. Emily did not stay because she was weak. They stayed because their lives were interwoven with practical realities that required careful navigation. And here is something important. Staying does not mean you accept the distortion as truth. It does not mean you stop seeing clearly. In fact, staying with clarity is very different from staying in denial. Clarity allows you to disengage emotionally even if you remain physically present. It allows you to reduce expectations, to build parallel sources of fulfillment, to prepare for eventual change, whether internal or external. If you are still there, it does not automatically mean you have failed yourself. It may mean you are calculating variables others cannot see. The world loves decisive narratives. Leave, cut ties, start over. But real lives are complex, and sometimes the bravest thing is not a dramatic exit. It is a patient strategy. And the anchors no one talks about are heavy. But naming them removes some of their shame. You are not stuck because you are blind. You may be anchored because your life has weight, and weight requires planning, not impulsivity. Understanding that difference is not an excuse. It is maturity. And maturity does not move recklessly. It moves intentionally. Phoning it in as a strategy, not a personality. There is a stage in narcissistic relationships that rarely gets discussed with nuance. And it's not the explosive stage. It's not the awakening stage. It's not even the leaving stage. It's the strategic stage. The stage where you stop fighting for depth and start conserving energy. The stage where you show up. But you don't fully arrive. People call it phoning it in. And from the outside it can look cold, detached, resigned. But inside it is often the most calculated move you've made. Sarah in Boston reached that stage quietly. There was no dramatic turning point, no final argument that snapped something in half. Instead, there was a slow realization. Every attempt at emotional intimacy led to exhaustion. Every effort to repair led to circular conversations. Every vulnerable disclosure came back sharpened. So she made a decision, not to leave, not to confront, but to recalibrate. She would fulfill responsibilities. She would co-manage the household. She would remain polite, cooperative, civil. But she would stop trying to be deeply known. And the difference is subtle but profound. Phoning it in is not apathy. It is containment. It is the decision to reduce emotional investment where return on investment is consistently negative. Mark in Denver experienced this shift in his own way. He had spent years attempting to bring clarity to disagreements. He had tried logic, empathy, humor, patience. He had tried silence. He had tried engagement. Eventually, he noticed something. The more he tried to fix the emotional climate, the more destabilized he felt. So he stopped trying to fix it. He maintained logistics, discussed schedules, coordinated finances, showed up for public events, but he stopped seeking validation in that space. He reserved his interior life for safer places. And here's the key distinction. He didn't shut down as a person. He narrowed the channel of access. Phoning it in becomes dangerous when it turns into identity. But when it remains a strategy, it can protect identity. Emily in Nashville once described the shift as turning down the emotional volume, not turning it off. She still laughed at appropriate moments, still brought a casserole to family gatherings, still asked about someone's day. But she stopped expecting reciprocity. She stopped waiting for depth. She stopped believing that if she just tried harder, the relationship would transform. That surrender of fantasy is not weakness. It is clarity. And clarity can be stabilizing, because expectation is what drains you. When you expect warmth and receive indifference, it hurts. When you expect accountability and receive deflection, it destabilizes. When you expect repair and receive reversal, it erodes trust. But when you expect very little, when you understand the emotional range of the system, the shock diminishes. Phoning it in, at its healthiest form, is radical acceptance without internal collapse. It is saying, this is what this relationship is capable of. I will engage accordingly. It is not dramatic. It is disciplined. There is something important to acknowledge here. Phoning it in often gets confused with emotional numbness. But they are not the same. Numbness is unconscious. It spreads. It dulls everything. Strategic detachment is conscious. It has boundaries. It is applied selectively. Sarah still felt deeply with her children, with her closest friends, with herself in her journal at night. She simply stopped offering vulnerability in a space that mishandled it. That is not dissociation. That is discernment. But there is a cost, because when you consistently operate at partial capacity in one relationship, the emotional gap becomes visible. You notice other couples engaging in spontaneous conversation at restaurants. You observe ease, fluidity, mutual laughter, and something inside you tightens. Not envy exactly, more like grief. Grief for what never fully formed. In that grief must be acknowledged. If you suppress it, phoning it in becomes hollow. But if you allow yourself to feel it privately, phoning it in becomes strategy rather than resignation. Mark learned this when he realized something subtle. He wasn't angry anymore, he was tired. And exhaustion can masquerade as indifference. So he began asking himself a new question. Where am I fully alive? He invested more deeply in friendships, joined a local running group, reconnected with hobbies he had abandoned. He made sure that while one relationship remained surface level, his life did not. That distinction is crucial. If phoning it in becomes your default mode everywhere, it corrodes identity. But if it is contained to a specific dynamic, it preserves energy. There is also something psychologically empowering about shifting from reactive to intentional. When you fight constantly, you are reacting to volatility. When you phone it in strategically, you are choosing stability. You stop being pulled into every debate. You stop defending yourself against every subtle jab. You stop chasing apologies. You disengage from circular conversations. That disengagement reduces chaos. And sometimes in systems where you cannot fully leave, reduced chaos is the most humane option available, especially when children are involved, especially when finances are intertwined, especially when legal ties bind you for years. If phoning it in can protect the emotional climate of the home. But here is where self-awareness becomes critical. If you phone it in without acknowledging why, it can morph into identity erosion. You might start believing you are boring, emotionally unavailable, detached by nature. But the truth is different. You are not detached. You are selective. Selective vulnerability is wisdom. Selective engagement is maturity. And the danger lies in forgetting that selectivity is a choice, not a personality flaw. Emily once worried she had become cold. She noticed how easily she could nod through conversations without investing. But when she visited an old friend and found herself talking for hours, laughing freely, expressing opinions boldly, she realized something important. Her warmth was intact. It simply required safety. That realization reframed everything. Phoning it in had not stripped her of depth, and it had preserved her from depletion. There is another layer here that deserves honesty. Phoning it in can sometimes feel easier than hope. Hope requires vulnerability. Hope risks disappointment. When you release hope for emotional reciprocity in a specific space, you protect yourself from repeated injury. But releasing hope does not mean abandoning self-respect. It means redirecting hope. Instead of hoping the narcissistic system will transform, you begin hoping for growth elsewhere, for internal expansion, for new connections, for personal evolution. That shift restores agency. You are no longer waiting. You are building. It may not look dramatic. There are no fireworks, no grand declarations, just small, consistent acts of alignment. You maintain civility. You maintain boundaries. You maintain perspective. You do not escalate unnecessarily. You do not seek validation where it has historically been withheld. You conserve emotional currency. This is not glamorous, but it is powerful, because you stop bleeding energy into bottomless wells. And here is the most important truth of all. Phoning it in as a strategy only works if you remember that it is temporary. Temporary does not always mean short-term. It means intentional. It means you are choosing this posture while you gather strength, clarity, or resources. If you forget that you are choosing it, it begins to feel like fate. And fate feels suffocating. Choice feels empowering, even when the choices are constrained. Sarah eventually understood that she was not waiting for her partner to become someone else. She was stabilizing the present while evaluating the future. Mark recognized that detachment gave him space to think clearly rather than react impulsively. Emily saw that reducing emotional exposure gave her the strength to invest elsewhere. Phoning it in is not about shrinking. It is about pacing, and it is about recognizing that full emotional engagement in a distorted system is unsustainable. So you regulate exposure. You decide where to show up fully and where to show up functionally. You remind yourself, this is strategy, not self-erasure. And you check in regularly to ensure it hasn't spread beyond its intended boundaries. Because you deserve relationships where you do not have to ration authenticity. You deserve spaces where your full self is welcome. Until those spaces expand, you manage wisely. Not angrily, not bitterly, but deliberately. Phoning it in is not who you are. It is how you survived without collapsing. And survival, when done consciously, can be dignified. The key is remembering that beneath the strategy, your depth remains intact. Your warmth remains intact. Your capacity for connection remains intact. You are not half a person. You are a full person operating at partial capacity in a limited environment. And partial capacity in one place does not define your whole existence. It simply reflects your awareness. And awareness, even when quiet, is strength. The cost of living half-present. There is a slow erosion that happens when you live half-present long enough. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with a breakdown or a crisis. It arrives quietly, in forgotten appointments, in dulled laughter, in the way your eyes glaze over during conversations that once would have stirred you. Living half-present is not the same as giving up. It is not the same as depression. It is something subtler. It is the chronic act of withholding yourself in order to remain stable. And withholding, even when strategic, has a cost. Sarah in Boston began noticing it in small ways. She would walk into a room and forget why she was there. She would reread emails at work because her focus felt fragmented. She wasn't incompetent. She wasn't incapable. But part of her attention was always elsewhere. Scanning, bracing, moderating. When you spend years regulating yourself inside a system that requires vigilance, your nervous system rarely fully rests. Even when things are calm, your body remembers the pattern, so you hover. Not in panic, but in subtle readiness. That readiness consumes energy. Mark in Denver experienced it as fatigue he couldn't explain. He was functioning well at work, meeting deadlines, performing adequately. But by the end of each day, he felt drained in a way that sleep didn't fix. It wasn't the workload, it was the internal management, the constant calibrating of what to say, when to say it, how to avoid unnecessary friction. When you live half-present, part of your mind is always filtering, and filtering is exhausting. Emily in Nashville described it as being emotionally on airplane mode. Messages come in, you respond, but nothing syncs fully. Joy doesn't land the way it used to. Excitement feels muted. Even anger feels distant. You become functional instead of alive. Functional is efficient. Alive is expansive. And the difference matters. There is also a physical toll that often goes unnamed. Tight shoulders, shallow breathing, interrupted sleep, digestive discomfort, headaches that appear without clear cause. Your body absorbs what your voice does not release. When you do not fully express, your system stores, and storage over time weighs heavily. In living half-present can also distort your sense of self. When you consistently operate in controlled mode, you may forget what spontaneous mode feels like. You hesitate before speaking your unfiltered thoughts. You measure your laughter. You suppress impulses to share. Eventually, you begin asking yourself, is this just who I am now? Am I less passionate, less interesting, less vibrant? But here is the truth. You are not less. You are contained. Containment was adaptive, but prolonged containment can feel like shrinkage. Sarah once noticed something startling. At a friend's birthday dinner, surrounded by people she trusted, she felt herself loosening. Her humor returned. Her curiosity sharpened. She spoke more freely. On the drive home, she felt grief. Not because the evening was bad, because she realized how much of herself she had been holding back elsewhere. That grief is important. It signals that your full self is still intact. Living half-present also affects memory. When you dissociate mildly over long periods, experiences blur. Days blend together. Moments feel interchangeable. You may struggle to recall specific conversations or details, not because you are incapable, but because presence enhances memory. And when presence is rationed, memory softens. Mark once tried to remember the last time he felt deeply connected in his relationship. He struggled to pinpoint it. Not because it never happened, but because the emotional intensity had flattened. Flattened experiences are harder to anchor. Another cost is decision fatigue. When you constantly monitor the emotional climate, you expend cognitive energy before real decisions even arise. You are already tired when larger choices present themselves. That fatigue can create paralysis. It can make you doubt your ability to navigate change. But fatigue is not incompetence. It is depletion. There is also a more existential cost. A living half-present can quietly narrow your world. You may stop dreaming, stop imagining alternative futures, stop exploring new interests. Not because you lack imagination, but because your system prioritizes stability over expansion. Expansion feels risky when you are already stretched. Emily realized this when she looked back at old journals from years earlier. The entries were bold, ambitious, curious. Her recent entries felt careful, practical, measured. And that realization wasn't condemnation, it was awareness. Half-presence protects you from volatility, but it can also protect you from growth. The most subtle danger is normalization. You may begin believing this is adulthood, that everyone feels slightly muted, that relationships naturally cool into politeness. But healthy maturity does not require self-fragmentation. It does not require chronic withholding. It allows for depth, repair, and vitality, even if imperfectly. And the cost of living half-present is not always immediate suffering. It is gradual detachment. From yourself, from your desires, from your own aliveness. And here is the paradox. You adopted half-presence to survive. But if it becomes permanent, it becomes its own limitation. The solution is not dramatic upheaval. It is restoration of full presence in safe spaces. Sarah began practicing deliberate immersion in conversations with trusted friends, in solo walks without distraction, and in creative projects that absorbed her fully. Mark committed to activities that demanded engagement. Running, community involvement, skill building. Emily reintroduced vulnerability slowly with people who demonstrated consistency. Presence can be rebuilt. It does not disappear permanently. It recedes when it is unsafe. The cost of living half-present is real, but so is your capacity to reclaim presence. The key is awareness. To notice when you are drifting, and to recognize when neutrality has become numbness. To ask gently, where can I be fully here? You do not need to shame yourself for the years you operated in survival mode, but you do need to guard against allowing survival to become identity. You were never meant to live as a partial version of yourself. You were meant to feel fully, to speak freely, to laugh deeply, to remember vividly. Half-presence kept you stable. Now awareness can guide you toward wholeness. And wholeness, even if rebuilt slowly, is always worth the effort. Reclaiming your voice. Without burning the house down, reclaiming your voice does not have to look like a dramatic exit. It does not require packed suitcases at midnight. It does not demand a final speech delivered with shaking hands. It does not always involve cutting every tie and walking away without looking back. Sometimes reclaiming your voice is quieter than that. Sometimes it is so subtle that no one but you notices it at first. But after years of adapting, adjusting, softening, filtering, and containing, the idea of suddenly becoming bold can feel destabilizing. You may even fear that if you fully unleash your truth, everything will collapse. The house will burn down. The system will explode. Chaos will replace the fragile stability you've worked so hard to maintain. So the question becomes, how do you return to yourself without detonating your entire life? Sarah in Boston began this process not with confrontation, but with honesty in private. She stopped arguing internally about whether her perceptions were valid. She stopped debating with herself in the quiet hours of the night. She allowed one simple shift. Instead of asking, "Am I overreacting?" she asked, "What am I feeling?" That shift sounds small. It is not, because reclaiming your voice begins internally before it ever becomes external. If you cannot validate yourself, no amount of outward expression will feel stable. Mark in Denver did not start by issuing ultimatums. He started by changing how he spoke to himself. When conflict happened, instead of immediately dissecting his flaws, he paused. He allowed space for the possibility that his perspective held weight. He did not announce this shift. He practiced it silently. And over time, something steadied. Reclaiming your voice without burning the house down requires differentiation. And differentiation means you can maintain your sense of self even when someone else disagrees, dismisses, or distorts. It means their reaction does not automatically redefine your truth. That does not require shouting. It requires grounding. Emily in Nashville practiced this in conversations that felt low stakes. When she disagreed with a minor opinion, she did not retreat immediately. She expressed it calmly. She let the discomfort sit without scrambling to smooth it over. In these micro moments build resilience. Because voice is not just about content, it is about nervous system regulation. If every disagreement sends you into panic, you cannot sustain authenticity. So reclaiming your voice often begins with strengthening your ability to tolerate discomfort without collapsing or escalating. There is another important element: selective transparency. Reclaiming your voice does not mean exposing your deepest vulnerabilities to someone who has historically mishandled them. It means discerning where your truth is safe. Sarah chose to speak more openly with trusted friends before attempting depth at home. Mark invested in therapy where he could articulate thoughts without being interrupted or reframed. Emily joined a community group where her ideas were met with engagement rather than dismissal. Voice grows in safe soil. You do not plant it in concrete and expect it to thrive. At some point, however, you may feel compelled to express yourself directly within the relationship itself. If you do, the key is intention. Are you speaking to change them, or are you speaking to align with yourself? If the goal is transformation, disappointment may follow. If the goal is alignment, success is internal. Reclaiming your voice is less about their response and more about your congruence. You may say, calmly, "That's not how I experienced it." You may state, "I'm not comfortable with that." You may decline without elaborate explanation. You do not have to defend every boundary. You do not have to win every argument. Sometimes the power lies in stating and stepping back. There will likely be pushback. Narcissistic systems resist shifts in dynamic. When you stop shrinking, the imbalance becomes more visible. But reclaiming your voice does not require aggression. It requires steadiness. Mark discovered that silence could sometimes be more powerful than debate. When baited into circular arguments, he chose disengagement instead of explanation. Not as punishment, not as control, but as refusal to participate in distortion. Emily learned that she could allow misunderstandings to exist without rushing to correct every narrative. Not every misinterpretation required defense. Sarah practiced something even deeper. She stopped seeking validation for her emotional experiences, and instead of asking, "Do you understand why that hurt?" she allowed herself to know that it did. That internal permission is foundational, because if your voice depends on external approval, it remains fragile. Reclaiming your voice also means reclaiming your desires, not just your grievances. What do you want? What energizes you? What feels expansive? When you have spent years managing volatility, desire can feel indulgent, but desire reconnects you to agency. Emily began pursuing interests independent of the relationship. Mark invested in professional growth that was not contingent on household approval. Sarah made decisions about her time without excessive consultation. Each small act reinforced identity. You are not only someone reacting to distortion, you are someone with direction. There is grief in this stage, grief for the years spent minimizing yourself. Grief for the version of the relationship you hoped would exist. Allow it. Grief softens defensiveness. Without processing grief, reclaiming your voice can become fueled by resentment instead of clarity. Resentment burns houses down. Clarity builds exits, whether literal or emotional. The goal is not to become confrontational. It is to become congruent. Congruence means your inner experience and outer behavior align more closely. Not perfectly, not overnight, but increasingly. You begin saying what you mean in measured ways. You begin honoring what you feel without immediate dismissal. You begin choosing where to invest energy rather than scattering it in reactive defense. Over time, something remarkable happens. The house may still stand, the system may not transform dramatically, but you are no longer disappearing inside it. You are standing inside it differently, and that difference changes everything. Reclaiming your voice without burning the house down is an act of precision. It is strength under control, and it is courage without chaos. It is the slow return to yourself. And once you return, even partially, you realize something important. You were never voiceless. You were adapting. Now you are choosing, and choice is where freedom begins. Sarah in Boston, Mark in Denver, and Emily in Nashville did not set out to lose themselves. They began like many people do, hopeful, committed, willing to work through conflict. What unfolded over time was not a sudden collapse but a slow adaptation, and they questioned their own character when reality was distorted. They learned that honesty could trigger backlash, so they softened the truth. They hid small pieces of autonomy in coffee cans and quiet notebooks. They triangulated out of desperation when direct communication failed. They phoned it in strategically to reduce chaos. They lived half-present to preserve stability. And eventually they faced the deeper cost of survival, the quiet erosion of self. Their story is not about weakness. It is about resilience under psychological pressure. Each coping mechanism they developed had a purpose. Lying reduced conflict, detachment preserved energy, silence prevented escalation. These were not personality flaws. They were adaptations to an environment that could not tolerate full authenticity. The profound lesson here is this: survival strategies are intelligent responses to unsafe emotional conditions, but they are not meant to become permanent identities, even when the environment changes or when awareness deepens. Those strategies must be re-examined. The work is not to shame yourself for how you coped, but to ask whether those behaviors are still serving you. For you, this may look like noticing where you automatically shrink in conversations. It may mean practicing honesty in safe spaces first. It may mean separating your identity from the coping patterns you developed. It may mean asking, where can I be fully present again? Growth does not always require burning everything down. Sometimes it begins with internal alignment. Recognizing your perception as valid, your needs as legitimate, and your voice as worthy. You are not the distortion you endured. You are not the coping mechanisms you learned. You are the awareness that is now questioning them. Disclaimer. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional diagnosis or therapy from a licensed mental health professional. Now here's a question for you. A. Do you feel like you are still operating in survival mode in at least one relationship? B. Or do you feel you have already begun reclaiming your authentic self? Comment A or B below, and I'd love to hear your perspective. Which part of this journey resonated with you the most? What insight changed the way you see your own situation? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your experience. If this series helped you gain clarity, subscribe to the channel. Your support motivates us to continue creating thoughtful, honest content that empowers you to understand yourself and your relationships more deeply.